Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. It's good to have you with us today for our lesson, which is for the East Kilbride congregation for Sunday, the 17th of January 2021. Of course, in Scotland, we are still in lockdown. I've been listening to the United States news for a while as well, and they're talking about not getting to a degree of normality until at least the autumn, and possibly with travel restrictions throughout the entire year. In the UK, we're talking about the possibility of all adults having been vaccinated by July, which would be great if that does happen. So we may be in lockdown for a while because of the extreme virility of this particular strain that's going through the UK just now. But at the same time, we may be able to get out and begin worshiping again soon. So we'll have to listen up to the announcements that are made in Scotland. I was able to go by the building last Saturday, and it was nice to see the building in snow and no car tracks in the car park. But if you notice, there are lots of animal tracks. We have foxes that live within our site, and they were very active in the snow, as you can see. On Monday, I very much enjoyed being able to babysit for our grandson, Joe. His mother and dad had to go to a prenatal appointment, and that is one of the reasons that you can leave your area, is to provide essential child care for pregnant mothers, for expecting mothers. So I was very pleased to be able to do that and spend some time with our grandson. It's had some great snow during the week. Again, we had snow all day on Thursday. It made everything look absolutely beautiful. But of course, I'm recording this on Saturday morning, and it's a lot warmer, and it's raining, and the snow is gone except where people were building snowmen. But let's get into our lesson for today. Before we get into the text of the New Testament letter of James, I think it's good to talk a little bit about who wrote it. And as is normal in first century letters, the name of the writer is at the beginning. And when you consider that these were rolled scrolls, as we see in this picture here, this does make sense. As you knew who it was from when you started reading the letter, rather than having to quickly scroll through it to the very end to see who it was from. With our letters on single sheets of paper, and of course now it's more electronic, isn't it, with emails or even text messages. We see who it's from before we even start reading. And that was the same as it was in the first century. When they received their letters and scrolls, the name was at the beginning. The text tells us that this is from James, a slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, and he gives his greetings. So we learned that the letter we call James is called that because it was written by a disciple of Jesus who was named James. Now, this doesn't tell us which James it was. We will examine that in just a minute. If I'm correct in who wrote this letter, I believe his story is one of importance to us. He shows us that someone can go from being a person who did not believe in Jesus to someone who became a leader among the disciples, and it would seem died because of his belief. But I get ahead of myself. Let's begin by looking at who wrote this letter. Before we get to that, though, let me call your attention to one other thing. His name really wasn't James. If you look up, read it from the Greek text, you discover his name is Jacobus. And that would be more literally translated Jacob. Well, why then do we not know this letter and writer as Jacob instead of James? I asked that question to a Greek teacher I had at one point, and this is what I was told. Apparently, Jacob was too Jewish when they began translating the scriptures into English, and therefore he became James. I thought that was interesting because, of course, he was Jewish. What would you expect? But it'd be quite neat to have had the reference to all of those we have as James in our scriptures as Jacob. And as we know him as James, I'm going to refer to him in that way as well, with apologies, of course, to him for changing his name. So that leads us back to the question, which James are we talking about? And there's at least 5 that I've found in the New Testament who had the name James. Probably the most famous one is James the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. But there's another apostle, wasn't there, whose name was James? He was the son of Alphaeus. And there's a man who's known as James the Younger. He was the son of Mary. There's James, who is a brother of Jesus. And there is James, who is the father of the apostle Judas, but not referring to here as Judas Iscariot. So which one of these could it have been? Was it James the Apostle, son of Zebedee? It's actually attributed to him by one of the Codex Corbiensis, which are Latin manuscripts. There's a couple of them. And I can't remember which one it was. In my notes, I just had it was one of them. I don't really believe it was him, and I'll tell you why. He died as a martyr. It's recorded in Acts chapter 12. That dates to around 44 AD. Now, this letter is usually dated as one of the earliest of letters in the late 40s, possibly around 48. Well, one thing that tells us is that this James would have been dead before the letter was written. So I don't really think it was him. What about James, the son of Alphaeus? He's mentioned as one of the apostles in the list of the apostles in Matthew 10, chapter 3. But the thing is, we know very little about him apart from his name. From what we know about what was going on in Jerusalem in the first century, he does not seem to have been a prominent Christian leader there. And it would seem that this letter is written by somebody who's well known by Jewish Christians, and in particular in the area of Jerusalem, or who had connections to Jerusalem. So I would suggest it's probably not him, although there are some commentators who do attribute it to him. Well, what about James the Younger, the son of Mary? His mother is mentioned as one of the ones at the crucifixion. And she's mentioned as being Mary, the mother of James the Younger. And that's really about all we know about him. So I would suggest it's very doubtful that it could be him. What about James, the father of Judas? That is not Judas Iscariot. He's mentioned in Luke chapter 6, verse 16, as the father of the other Judas, who is one of the apostles. Thing is, we don't even know if he was a disciple. So very unlikely that it was him. And that leads us with a 5th one. What about the brother of Jesus? Now, although he was not a disciple during Jesus' life on the earth, he is named among the believers in Acts chapter 1. We know that he became a leader of the Christians in Jerusalem. We read about that in Galatians chapter 2. He was highly respected by the apostles. And he is identified by many early Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries as being the writer of this particular letter. And I believe that he is the writer of this letter. So that's the reference I'm going to have, that this is James, brother of Jesus, who's writing this letter. Now he, as you can see here, he early on was not even a disciple. what caused the change in James? And this, I believe, is a good lesson for us as we begin looking at our being disciples of Jesus. This James goes from being an unbeliever to not only being a disciple, but being a leader amongst the Christians. Let's have a look at his life. We first meet James as one of the brothers at the wedding in Cana. And although they're not mentioned as being at the wedding in verse 2 of John 2, they are mentioned as they traveled to Capernaum in verse 12. John records this. After this, that's the wedding in Cana, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So he's at least with Jesus in that early part of Jesus' teaching. As weddings were family affairs, I think we can have some certainty that James was present for Jesus' first miraculous sign. He's mentioned later on in Matthew chapter 13 and in other lists of Jesus' family. Matthew 13, verse 55 in particular, and begin reading at verse 54. Then he came to his hometown, began to teach the people in their synagogue. They were astonished and said, "Where did this man get such wisdom and miraculous power? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother named Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And aren't all his sisters here with us? So where did he get all this?" And so they took offense at him. One thing we learn from these lists here is that Jesus is from a family of at least 8 children. 7 children, sorry about that. Because there is Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, which are 5 brothers, and there's at least 2 sisters as well. So he's from a rather large family of children, could have been 8, but most likely 7 at least. James is listed first amongst these. So I would suggest that possibly he's the next oldest, at least amongst the brothers, to Jesus. Now his brothers didn't believe in him while he was on the earth. John records this in John chapter 7. Beginning in verse 2. Now the Jewish feast of shelters was near. So Jesus' brothers advised him, "Leave here and go to Judea so your disciples may see your miracles that you're performing. For no one who seeks to make a reputation for himself does anything in secret. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world." And then John comments, "For not even his brothers believed in him." It might initially seem strange to us that his brothers didn't believe. They question, "Are you going to go up to the Feast of Shelters?" And they sort of cast dispersion on him, don't they? They don't believe. But having said that, put yourself in in their shoes. This was their big brother they grew up with. In their minds, I don't think there could be any way that he could be the Messiah. After all, they could have said, "We've known him all of his life." In fact, if you've got a big brother or an older sibling, think of it in those terms. I mean, I have an older brother, a big brother, and there's no way if Ed suddenly said, "I'm the Messiah," I'd say, "Absolutely not. I know you." But so I can understand why they wouldn't believe in him. Sometimes the hardest people to convince are that you've changed, or there's something different, are the people in your own family. But the works, the signs that he's been doing should have shown them that they really didn't know their big brother as well as they thought they did. And it would seem, I believe, that they were at that wedding in Cana. So they've at least seen something spectacular. It is, again, I think of significance that they weren't at the crucifixion. We read about this in John chapter 19. Jesus is hanging on the cross. As the oldest son, Jesus would be the one to take care of his mother. And it would seem that Joseph has already passed on. With his death, it would have been natural to pass on Mary's care to his next brother, who, as I mentioned, seems to have been James. But at the cross, John records that he gave the care of his mother to the Apostle John, and he appears to be one of the cousins. But at that time, Jesus did not believe in his brother as the Messiah. Let's advance forward a few weeks, a month or so, beyond the crucifixion. When we get to Acts chapter 1, that's the first time we see James after Jesus' crucifixion, not by name, but mentioned as the family group. This is what we find in verse 12. Then they, referring to the apostles, returned to Jerusalem from the mount called the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. When they had entered Jerusalem, they went to the upstairs room where they were staying. Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James were there. All these continued together in prayer with one mind, together with the women, along with Mary the mother of Jesus and his brothers. So they are there with the disciples in Acts chapter 1. This James seems to be mentioned by Peter over in Acts chapter 12. After Peter had been released from prison by the angel, he goes to Mary's house and explains what's happened, and he gives this message in verse 17. Peter motioned to them with his hand to be quiet and then related how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. He said, "Tell James and the brothers these things," and then he left and went to another place. Now this James here isn't James, the brother of John, the apostle that he's so close to. That James had already been killed. This would seem to be Jesus' brother. He has become a prominent disciple. We get to Acts chapter 15. He takes a prominent role at the meeting in Jerusalem to discuss the Gentiles becoming Christians. This seems to be the brother of James. He's the one we read about in Acts 15 who summarizes the discussion and constructs the letter that's to be sent to accept Gentiles as Christians without becoming Jews. Paul talked about him in the book of Galatians. And the first two chapters, when he gives that little autobiographical section there. In chapter 2, verse, he refers to James. In chapter 1, verse 19, in this way, "But I saw none of the other apostles except James the Lord's brother." Now that's interesting. He seems to be referring to him here as an apostle. That's the simplest reading we have there. Some have suggested, though, that what he's saying is, I saw none of the apostles. The only one I saw none of the other apostles. The only other person I saw was James. That's a possibility there as well. But in chapter 2, verse 9, Paul recorded this. "When James, Cephas, and John, who had a reputation as pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." Notice, he's referred to as one of the pillars of the Christians there in Jerusalem, along with Cephas, Peter, and John, one of the three. So one thing we see is that he was a leader amongst the Christians in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 21, verse 18, we find that Paul met with him following his third teaching tour. Doesn't seem that Peter was any longer in Jerusalem. Tradition tells us that he was known as James the Just because of his virtuous life. Eusebius wrote, and this is a few hundred years later, that he spent so much time in prayer on his knees that his knees grew worn and hard like those of a camel. Josephus recorded that he died a martyr's death by being stoned in Jerusalem in 63 AD. That leads us to ponder the question again. What was it that caused this man who had been an unbeliever to become not only a leader amongst the early Christians, but also to be willing to die because he followed Jesus the Messiah? I would suggest that the answer to this question is what Paul records in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7. Beginning back in verse 5, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as though to one born at the wrong time, he appeared also to me. One way Jesus didn't appear to many people after his resurrection. The list there is short, although we might say, well, he did appear to quite a few because there's more than 500 at one time. But there weren't too many individuals, were there? But he did appear to James, and this, at least in my mind, would seem to be his brother. Some have suggested it was James the Apostle to sort of strengthen him, but I believe this would be his brother. I believe this would be what we see that caused that change. And seeing the risen Messiah changes people. It changed people, didn't it? Think about it. Peter, and he's mentioned there in the list, he was changed from being impetuous and rash to becoming a pillar and a proclaimer. After he saw the risen Jesus, he changed. Paul changed from being a persecutor to being a proclaimer when he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. And James changed from being a skeptic to being a pillar. I get the impression that he heard quite a bit of Jesus' teaching. I think that he was around Jesus quite a bit during the time that Jesus was teaching, because I think we're going to see this in this letter. And we're going to see, I'll be pointing out the parallels in the teaching of Jesus with what James records in his letter. Now, we may be thinking, if I could literally see Jesus, then that would change me too. Do you remember what Jesus said to Thomas? Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are the people who have not seen and yet have believed. Although we may not see Jesus as those that saw him after he resurrected, we still have the evidence that he rose from the dead. There's the empty tomb. There's the changed lives of people, such as James and Peter and Paul. There's people who are willing to die for their belief that Jesus is alive and now reigning on David's throne. See, Jesus said that was enough to see that he really was the Messiah. Like James, we can radically change our lives, going from being a skeptic to becoming a strong, dedicated Christian because of our relationship with the risen Jesus. Change is something that must be a constant part of our lives as Christians. We will never arrive at a point where we never need further change, because changing is part of growing, isn't it? Let's all resolve to make change a part of our lives as we examine our lives against the example that Jesus has left for us. Jesus wants us to change from serving sin to serving Him, to truly become His disciple. Always remember, though, change is not forced on us. It wasn't forced on James, but it's a path that we must choose. And I hope that our lessons this year, as we look at lessons from the letter of James, will help us on our path as we seek to become more and more like Jesus, as we learn to be disciples of Jesus. A hymn that talks about this change in our life was written by Rufus McDaniel back in 1914. Rufus McDaniel was ordained, as some are, in the Christian church in 1873. He found a lot of joy in religious music and hymns and church music, and he began writing hymns in the 1880s. I get the impression that he wrote both the words and the music. He wrote, "I feel in my soul that God has something for me to do in brightening the experience of struggling souls. My chief desire is to be a blessing, if possible, to my fellow men through these hymns and thereby glorify God in the name of His dear Son, whose I am and whom I serve." The only song I know that he wrote is this one, "Since Jesus Came Into My Heart." And it is a joyful song. And if this is characteristic of what he wrote, I think he succeeded in brightening the experience of struggling souls. This particular hymn goes this way: "What a wonderful change in my life has been wrought since Jesus came into my heart. I have light in my soul for which long I had sought, since Jesus came into my heart." And it's got a chorus that comes after each of the verses. And the chorus is this: "Since Jesus came into my heart, since Jesus came into my heart, floods of joy o'er my soul like the sea billows roll, since Jesus came into my heart." The other verses are these: "I'm possessed of a hope that is steadfast and sure, since Jesus came into my heart. And no dark clouds of doubt now my pathway obscure, since Jesus came into my heart. There's a light in the valley of death now for me, since Jesus came into my heart. And the gates of the city beyond I can see, since Jesus came into my heart." And the final verse: "I shall go there to dwell in that city I know, since Jesus came into my heart. And I'm happy, so happy, as onward I go, since Jesus came into my heart." Thank you for viewing our lesson this week, and I look forward to presenting more lessons in person, hopefully very soon, for those who are in East Kilbride, but they will still be posted to this YouTube channel. So if you want to follow them, you're more than welcome to join us each week.